Yeah, those who are against our membership of European Union are already saying, hey, this deal doesn't amount to anything. Let's get some expert opinion. I've got three guests I'm going to talk to in the next 20 minutes or so, as well, of course, as keeping up to date with the tennis. Professor Steve Pears, who is an expert on the EU law, University of Essex. Charles Grant, Director of the Pro-EU Centre for European Reform. And actually just talk about negotiations with Steve Jones, who's actually an expert in just how you negotiate, because this business, it comes to many of us in many parts of life. How do you negotiate? Are you a good negotiator? I confess I'm a totally rubbish negotiator. I tend to give in almost immediately. Right, Steve Pears, what do you make of what you've heard about this latest deal?
Well, I think it's going to cause political problems if we can't just make the decision in the UK and it has to be approved by someone in Europe, whether it's other member states or the Commission. It would probably be better for Cameron to come back with a different version saying, let's say the UK takes the decision and perhaps we could be overruled. That's still a little bit awkward, but at least with the starting point, I think
if you dressed it up and said we are going to apply this emergency brake, of course they may well choose to try and review this, but this is our power. It would sound better that way rather than saying we have to go and ask them whether we can do it or not.
It would be, and also that would work better in practice because you need a majority to overturn us rather than a majority support to go along with us. So we'd be more likely to get what we want in practice.
Righto. Charles Grant, what do you make of what you've heard?
I think this is quite significant. As recently as a couple of days ago, quite senior people in the government were saying to me they couldn't see how a deal could be done because the Commission was bashing down some promising ideas coming out of Berlin. And this is a new development. I mean, the Commission actually came up with the idea of the emergency brake, but they've been designing it in a way that really wouldn't be acceptable for the British. The Commission said that the Commission should decide whether the brake should be used or not. And I think we're moving forwards from a British point of view. If as Steve Pearce says, the British perhaps can apply the brake and then it can only be overturned or stopped by a majority of the other member states. And by the way, Katja Adler said, most member states don't like these ideas. In fact, the ones who've been really opposed have been the Poles and the Romanians, the Bulgarians and some of the other Central Europeans. I think the French, the Germans, the Italian, the Spanish are not too hostile to British demands here. So I think as long as Cameron can do something that satisfies the Poles and some of the other Central Europeans, the bulk of the member states will go along with it.
Yeah, I wonder how this will play when it comes to us voting on the future of Europe. So if this is the shape of the deal, I'll give you a John Redwood quote. I know he's an arch critic of Europe. He says, so we have to beg in extreme circumstances for permission of the rest of the EU to temporarily not make payments we don't want to make. If that is the deal, that's the way it'll be portrayed. And when you say it like that, Charles, doesn't sound too good, does it?
Well, whatever you offer John Redwood, he would oppose it, of course. I think from Cameron's point of view, Cameron is trying to convince the floating voters, the sort of moderate Eurosceptics in his own party, if he can present this emergency brake as a way of meaning that his original demand of withholding benefits for 4 years for EU migrants can be satisfied. That's actually quite good for Cameron. Now, the difficulty for Cameron is to then say, and this will reduce the number of migrants. Now, the question is, do the migrants come for the in-work benefits like tax credits, or do they come for the job opportunities? And I think many of us would argue that they come for the jobs rather than the benefits. So Cameron's going to need to make that connection between the benefits and migration.
Right. I'm going to come back to you both and talk about what happens next in Europe. In a way, I've got a feeling that to the rest of Europe, Britain's demands for various bits and pieces of change seem almost irrelevant in view of the great challenges that Europe is facing at the moment. But as I say, I'd like to come back to both of you. We'll talk about negotiating. Steve Jones, I know you're a kind of expert, the man we call in to ask about negotiations in a curious sort of way. It's the same game, whether you're trying to negotiate the price of a car or whether you're dealing with a neighbour with a particular complaint or whether you're dealing with a lot of neighbours with complaints like Europe. Negotiations. Is David Cameron a good negotiator, do you think?
Well, it's hard to say, isn't it? Because you don't actually see him negotiating. All you see is the fallout from it. But in reality, if you look at what he's trying to do here, I don't often agree with Mr. Redwood, but it does sound like a classic fudge. There is no...
Yeah, that's what you get out of Europe, isn't it? That's always what you get out of Europe. You get fudges, because if you get lots of disparate elements coming together, in the end you have to kind of stitch something together, don't you?
Well, you do and you don't. But if you haven't got an agreement on what's going to happen under what circumstances, then it's not a deal, is it? It's just a sort of a vague assertion. If you look at, without commenting on the politics of it, if you look at what happened with the recent dispute with the junior doctors, the junior doctors' unions went in with a mandate that they would go on strike. So it's very much, if you don't do this, then our sanctions are going to be that. And if you look at the situation with Mr. Cameron and Europe, he hasn't got a mandate from the country that if push comes to shove, we'll pull out of Europe, and that's the big stick. He hasn't got a big stick to wave. He's just relying on persuading other people rather than negotiating with them.
Yeah, I guess that's an interesting element. I mean, Steve Pears, come back to you about the future of Europe. When I suggested that, in a way, David Cameron's demands probably don't seem that important to the rest of Europe, and when you compare them with the kind of challenges they face because, for instance, of a number of migrants trying to get into the place.
Well, exactly. I think this summit coming up in February is also meant to deal with that subject. So I think for someone like Mrs. Merkel, this is a much less important issue for her future, even staying as the leader in Germany, than, in fact, trying to deal with the migrant refugee crisis. That's what she's going to be spending 90% of her time thinking about, and so will quite a few others like the Swedes and so on.
Right. Righto. I just want to go across I warn you I'll do this, but I want to catch up with Russell Fuller at the tennis. Andy Murray's been playing better in this second set. How's it going, Russell?
He has a set point, but it is on the Milos Raonic serve. 5-6. 30-40, Raonic serves. Forehand return from Murray. The volley into the net from Raonic, and Murray has got the break at the critical stage. Murray had been putting more pressure on the Raonic serve throughout this second set. He'd had his opportunities, Raonic had held on, but just as we thought we were going into a tie-break, a double fault from Raonic, a brilliant rally won by Murray with a forehand cross-court winner, and then a canny return. The Canadian nets the volley, and Murray has levelled the match so crucially by taking the second set, Peter, by 7-5.
You've got to give us full marks for timing there, haven't you, really, Russell? That was a good...
I've never doubted your timing, Peter, not for a moment.
That was a good moment. Normally I do that and we get sort of 8 successive points, but that was brilliant. We'll try and do that again. And a very good point to catch up on. Great to hear. So that's one set all, and you'll hear the game unfolding here on 5 Live. And if you want to hear ball by ball commentary, it's not cricket, is it? But hit by hit commentary, then you can go across to 5 Live Extra. We're talking about Europe because it remains the grand issue. It won't be that long before we're going to have to vote on this issue. And that's quite a thought, isn't it? What will be the deciding factor? Will you actually worry about this particular set of reforms which David Cameron is trying to achieve? Is that the key factor? Charles Grant, I mean, how much does it really matter? I don't know how much difference it will make and how much it really matters with the shape of the package that David Cameron emerges with about which way people vote.
I think it does matter because although most of us voters are not going to read his bit of paper that he brings back from Brussels, a lot of Conservative members of Parliament will. And I've been speaking to them, and to my surprise, many of them say to me they're not sure which way to go. They're genuinely going to study the details of the package and also perhaps consider their career prospects and whether they're going to be promoted by Cameron and Osborne. But I think the details matter. If Cameron can get a half-credible package, I would estimate most Tory MPs will back him, and that will be influential in the way the referendum pans out and the way the media report it. But even if you and I don't read all the details, I think the Tory MPs will. I would like to take issue with something Steve Jones said. Steve Jones said that Cameron doesn't have much leverage in this negotiation.
Well, he said he'd have real leverage if he said, look, either you do this or we're off. Then that gives you negotiating leverage.
My point would be actually having a referendum gives him leverage. I think one of the reasons why the Commission's come up with this quite interesting idea today is that they realise that if Cameron doesn't get something quite decent, he could even recommend an out vote in a referendum. Probably wouldn't, but he might in the last resort. And the fact that if the British people leave the EU, that's a big problem for everybody. So that does give him some leverage. And I think the other member states will support these new ideas because they're very worried about the prospect of Britain leaving. It would be a huge problem for the EU.
Steve Pears, how do you see it going?
Well, I think the idea that we try to negotiate after the referendum would be awkward, because if there was a leave vote, other member states wouldn't say, "Oh, well, that's your strike mandate from the members." In the way that unions work, they would say, "Well, you've decided to leave, so goodbye. We're not going to negotiate. We'll negotiate, of course, the terms of your departure, not the terms of your staying in." And some people who voted leave would, of course, want to leave, not try and stay in. And many of them. So it's very awkward to do it that way, as some people have suggested. And so it's not quite the same thing. We can't quite copy the union draconian process, it has to be different.
Yeah, I mean, if we did vote to come out, I think what will emerge during the course of the debate leading up to the referendum will be that people want to know what will happen then. And of course, the truth of the matter is, if we vote to come out, what we won't know is the shape of the package we're voting for. That might be one of the difficulties for the out campaign.
Well, exactly. I mean, they haven't even, on the whole, but there's two different out campaigns, and they haven't given a clear idea of what they think should happen. Of course, what they think should happen would anyway be dependent on negotiation with the EU. And I think a lot of other member states in the EU would say, well, we don't want other countries to take Britain's leave and lead, so we don't want to make it easy. And even if it might be better for us to have good trade relations, the more important thing for us is to make it very, very difficult and dissuade anyone else who wants to leave. Yeah. So I think that's the problem.
Yeah, Steve Jones talking about negotiations, if we were to vote to leave, that would be quite a tough bit of negotiating, wouldn't it? Because we'd then be saying, well, we've left now. We certainly have that mandate that you asked for, but you then got to sort out another deal which meets the expectations of people here at home without any idea of what's actually going to emerge.
Well, I think you're absolutely right. If you get to the stage where you've had a referendum and people have voted to pull out, you've left it a bit late to negotiate. But what you can do is you can, if you look at what the Greeks did, I've forgotten the guy's name, I won't disrespect him by attempting, Varoufakis, I think his name was they were putting out all sorts of messages about what's likely to happen. Now, to try to get people to move from their position, you haven't got to persuade them that you will leave. You've just got to persuade them there is a good chance that if you don't get what you want, you probably will.
You don't think we've softened them up enough with those kind of threats? Because David Cameron has essentially sounded like a bloke who wants to find an excuse to stay in, doesn't he? He doesn't talk about leaving with any enthusiasm.
Well, I mean, if you look at the things that they've started to do with the big corporate the companies that won't pay tax, this has been dragging on for 2 years. So I don't think that they've shown much resolve for trying to bite some of the rather unpleasant bullets that are going on. So I don't think the EU think that under any circumstances will pull out. And in reality, for the country, probably the best alternative is for Mr Cameron et al. To get a decent agreement on terms that work for the UK as well.
Right. Thank you for that, Steve. I mean, let me ask a couple of long-term questions about Europe, because in a way I find that just as interesting as our referendum. Europe does seem to be at a crossroads. The euro is certainly on the question, doesn't work for a lot of the countries involved. And now with free movement, Schengen, that seems to be under threat. So, Steve Pearce, what are we going to be left with, say, in 3 or 4 years' time in Europe? What's going to emerge from all this?
Well, we won't have to join the euro or Schengen even if we stay in, because we have cast iron protocol saying that we don't. I think these are issues that won't be easily solved. There are bound to be, I think, some more crises in Greece or maybe in Portugal, Spain, Italy about debt and bailouts. There won't be an easy solution to the refugee crisis because it involves sending people back to Turkey or stopping them from leaving, and that's going to be all difficult for all sorts of legal and political reasons. But all those problems will be there whether we stay in or not, and having an impact on us whether we stay in or not.
Yeah,
so I take
that. But what's Europe going to look like? I mean, are we going to find a Europe with a steel fence around it, for instance?
And I can imagine fences going up on Greek beaches or something similar to that, like return ferries that after they change the law, perhaps, to try and deal with those numbers. If the Turks accept it, of course, if they say we refuse to have people back, then it's not that simple. It's a difficult negotiation with Turkey as well. There's all these other things going on at the same time, which is why maybe this whole Brexit negotiation didn't get the attention that it would otherwise have done from the rest of the EU.
Charles Grant, what sort of Europe do you see emerging at the end of this process?
Well, I think I agree with what Steve Pearce said. I think we're going to see effectively a sort of two-tier Europe. We're going to see a Eurozone not forming a superstate, but certainly integrating more than it's done until now, with more coordination of economic policy, doing a lot of things together. And we're going to see an outer rim of countries like Britain, Poland, Sweden, Denmark, some of the other Central Europeans who don't want to join the euro, aren't going to join the euro, and will be part of the single market and do part of the EU foreign policy coordination, part of the judicial cooperation, police cooperation, but won't actually be part of the the euro, and that I think is a sort of two-tier or two-circle Europe emerging. That's the way it's going, which probably suits the British, because I don't think the British want to be part of an integrating federal eurozone at the centre, but they do want to be part of the economic. So we can have our telekinesis in a way. We can be part of the EU, but not the eurozone or the Schengen area, which, as Steve says, has got a lot of problems.
Yeah, what we really want is a free trade agreement. Remember, I think there used to be something called EFTA, European Free Trade Agreement. That sounded all right, Charles.
No, but with respect, EFTA wasn't the single market. Free trade means not having tariffs against imports and exports. Anybody can have that. Canada can have that with the EU. But what we have, which is much better, is the single market, which is regulatory convergence, mutual recognition of each other's standards. That's much better for our economy. That means you get rid of the so-called non-tariff barriers, like regulatory obstacles put in the way of British exporters. That's what we have in the single market. And Norway has it too. Norway has the single market, but it has to accept the rules written by others, by the rest of the EU member states, has to accept free movement of labour, has to pay into the EU budget. So the problem for the British, if we leave, is if you want the single market, you have to accept a Norwegian-style option, which isn't perhaps great from a British point of view.
Got it. Thanks very much indeed to all of you for the moment. As I say, we're trying to concentrate on the tennis, but thanks for your cooperation in enabling me to do that as well. Charles Grant, Professor Steve Pearce and Steve Jones, thank you to all three. This is an issue to which we will return on many occasions, I suspect.